Collapse and catastrophe. The fundamental flaw in climate scenario risk analysis, responding to the open consultation on the OSFI's standardized climate scenario exercise methodology. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society, and I'd like to discuss with you the intended methodology of the Office of the Superintendent for Financial Institutions, which is planning to implement a mandatory speculative climate risk analysis. And I'll show you why we think this is a very bad idea. And in fact, some aspects of it are quite astounding, the lack of due diligence. So this will probably be a bit of a long presentation, but I think there are elements in here that are crucially important because they reveal why people are trying to impose draconian laws and regulations on us to allegedly stop climate change. And once you see the basis that they're working from, you'll understand why it's completely unnecessary. And in fact, it's probably a form of fraud to be using that kind of a baseline. So let's walk through and see the different aspects of critique that we have of the plan of the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions for imposing mandatory climate risk reporting. So this is the body that I'm speaking about, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, and this is the page for their standardized climate scenario exercise. It's a draft for consultation. This was open to responses up until December the 22nd, 2023. So there's quite a bit on this page, which I won't show you all of it, but this is what it looks like, and you can see it online. It's important to note that foreign-funded environmental non-governmental groups are co-authoring the script here. The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions is supposed to be quite independent, but these three groups have been whittling away at the OSFI, and they claim that they have the expertise and interest in reducing the risks of climate change through law and policy. I don't think that they have the expertise in climate, but they certainly have the lobbying abilities. So the role of the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, what is it? Well, it supervises, it's supposed to be an independent federal government agency that regulates and supervises more than 400 federally regulated financial institutions, and that's to determine if they're in sound financial condition. And they also regulate and supervise 1,200 pension plans to determine if they meet the minimum funding requirements and are complying with other requirements. And their objective is to balance the goals of safety and soundness with the need for institutions to operate within a competitive marketplace. And what about the standardized climate scenario exercise? Well, they issued this on October the 16th, 2023, and they stated that the standardized climate scenario exercise aims to increase federally regulated financial institutions' understanding of their potential exposures to climate-related risks. It also aims to build their capacity to conduct climate scenario analysis and risk assessments. As a fully standardized exercise, the SCSE will also give OSFI a comparable quantitative assessment of climate-related risks across all of these financial institutions that it supervises. So it's gone from a Bank of Canada kind of pilot project to a complex speculative math. And here's some of the math equations that you can see here. I won't go into that, but I spoke with a retired lawyer who said to me about this: the OSFI regulation amounts to mandatory speculation. Why is that in the public interest? Well, that's a good question. So the first problem that we have with it is that they're abandoning historical experience. So they claim that they've developed this to help financial institutions under its supervision understand their climate risks and to provide a standardized tool. And this is how they describe the exercise: that they aim to measure climate risks that are arguably not reflected using traditional risk quantification techniques. For example, models that use historical experience to measure risks. Instead, they're going to be relying on future climate scenarios. And that's the problematic thing right there. So there's a misuse and misunderstanding of what's called RCP scenarios. This means representative concentration pathways, and they claim that this describes future emission patterns in consideration of future greenhouse gas emissions and other socioeconomic factors. They also claim that current policy scenarios for transition risk broadly aligns with RCP 8.5 scenario from a narrative perspective, since both scenarios involve limited or no climate policy action. Similarly, the narratives for Net Zero 2050 transition scenario and RCP 2.6 scenario broadly align, since they require immediate and significant policy action. So let's have a look at what this means. Now here's the graph of these RCPs, these representative concentration pathway scenarios. So you can see here that RCP 8.5 shows extreme warming and 2.6 does not. So on the surface, that appears to tell us that if this is supposedly the business as usual plan, we should definitely try and do this, right? But and you can also see that this is used by other bodies like Environment Canada. They also use the 2.6 and the 8.5. And you can see how it's graphically represented with bright red color, hot, hot, hot. And you can see also that the Prairie Climate Center and the Climate Atlas use RCP 8.5, and they also claim that this is the business as usual scenario. They claim that emissions continue to increase at current rates, and the high carbon future is based on RCP 8.5. And look at all the different government bodies and universities that are sponsoring the Climate Atlas of the Prairie Climate Center. All of them thinking that RCP 8.5 emissions continue to increase at current rates. Is that true? We'll find out in a minute. But first of all, they keep claiming that we must reduce our emissions to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial temperatures as per the Paris Agreement. But few people realize that the 1.5 degrees Celsius target is a political and not a scientific goal. And the RCP scenarios are not policy prescriptive, nor are they predictive. So according to the creators of the RCP scenarios, these scenarios are not meant to be used as policy prescriptive instruments. But this is what the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutes is doing, as is the Bank of Canada and the Bank for International Settlements. So that means that international finance is being skewed by improper use of the RCP scenarios. And here's what the creators of the RCP scenario said. They said the RCPs should not be interpreted as forecasts or absolute bounds or be seen as policy prescriptive. That means you shouldn't look at them as we just did, as I just showed you with the graph. We should not look at that graph and say, oh, the top one is business as usual, the bottom is our safe target, because they're not policy prescriptive, because the parameters that were entered into each one of them are quite different. They're not comparable. So you cannot really use them as policy prescriptive devices. And so you might say, well, why did they make them in the first place anyway, if not? Well, it's because they, like in a lab, when you're experimenting with things, they were trying to see, well, what happens if the population was bigger and a lot bigger? What happens if there were a lot more emissions? What happens if there were no emissions and there was a very small population? So they were just fiddling around with these different parameters for their own research purposes. They were not trying to tell people, oh, there should be X number of people on the planet and we should only use this much fossil fuels. That's not what they were about. It was strictly for research purposes, for understanding how different elements affect the representative concentration pathway of carbon dioxide. So, as they say here, at the same time, the use of the RCPs in climate research, that's just in climate research, may provide important information for decision making. But these are not policy prescriptive. They say it a couple of times in the same paragraph. Now, what's interesting is that Roger Pielke Jr., who is a longtime climate policy analyst, and another researcher named Justin Ritchie, have found that this RCP 8.5 is used very widely in research, and all of the scary climate emergency research is based on this, but it's not reality. It's very, very far from it. So this paper details how and why this has distorted the view of our climate future. And here's the important point. RCP 8.5 is an outlier of outliers. It is not business as usual. So the OSFI states the current policy scenario for transition risk broadly aligns with RCP 8.5 scenario from a narrative perspective, since both scenarios involve limited or no climate policy action. Well, most egregiously, OSFI refers to RCP 8.5 as if it broadly aligns with current policies for transition risk, when that's nowhere near the case, nor is it business as usual. RCP 8.5 has annual carbon dioxide emissions more than tripling by century's end. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere soaring to more than 900 parts per million, and the radiative forcing, which is a scientific concept used to quantify and compare the external drivers of change to Earth's energy balance, more than triple what it is today. And most spooky of all, in my opinion, is whereas the United Nations projects world population to be 9 billion people by 2100, the RCP 8.5 scenario assumed that it could be between 12 and 15 billion. That's 3 to 6 billion more than the UN estimate. So unfortunately, that might lead some people in power to think that depopulation is crucial to save the planet, or that draconian laws would be a wise thing to implement. In fact, RCP 8.5 is implausible and impossible. So Robert Lyman, former public servant and diplomat, writes in his report on the misuse of these scenarios, in the other three RCPs, they project primary energy use of 750 to 900 exajoules in 2100, which is about twice the level of today. But RCP 8.5 projects that it will reach 1700 exajoules, an energy-intensive scenario and lower rate of technology development. So you might say, well, maybe it will, right? I mean, what if it does? What if we can continue using all these fossil fuels and, we continue emitting like this? Like, why would it be a problem to say that we might increase the use of fossil fuels that much and end up with those catastrophic warming results? Well, here's why. It's corrupted science. The RCP 8.5 has been painted as business as usual by green billionaires Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg in their risky business project. The RCP 8.5 fossil fuel use projections are far beyond the limits of reality. So that's why we can't take it seriously. RCP 8.5 assumed that global coal use would increase over 800 exajoules. With respect to oil, under RCP 8.5, world crude oil production in 2100 would have to be about 4 times that of 2015 to meet the assumed demand. Well, that means that oil companies would have to find and produce roughly 4 trillion barrels of crude oil between now and 2100, and that's about twice the level of proven crude oil reserves now, plus the current estimate of technically recoverable resource potential. So that's just simply not going to happen. Plus, several academic papers have explored whether or not there are even enough coal reserves in the world to satisfy the demands assumed in RCP 8.5. So it's simply unrealistic. And yet it still proliferates everywhere. I believe it was Roger PLK Jr. who annotated this infographic. This shows the top 10 climate papers in 2020, and 6 of the top 10 papers are based on this unrealistic scenario. So we have one on the human climate niche, sandy coastlines under threat of erosion, dynamic ice loss from the Greenland ice sheet, fasting season length for global polar bear persistence. This one's important. The 2020 report of the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. This is why the medical community has gone all net zero on us. And the emergence of heat and humidity too severe for human tolerance. So these are all based on this implausible scenario, and yet they're the top papers in 2020 on climate. So without RCP 8.5, there is no case for high carbon taxes or net zero. This is according to Robert Lyman's perspective. Without the attention and credibility given to RCP 8.5, it's doubtful that a persuasive case could be made for high carbon dioxide taxes or net zero by 2050 policies. And going back to the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, they falsely characterize RCP 8.5 as if simply without climate policy. And they claim here that current policy scenario assumes there'll be no new climate policies being implemented, which, as I've shown you, is not at all what's happening with RCP 8.5. So the fatally flawed SCSE is a fraudulent misrepresentation of the future. The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutes has misunderstood the parameters of RCP 8.5, an outlier of outliers, and misunderstood what the RCP scenarios were originally designed for: climate research, not policy development or GHG reduction targets. Thus, the standardized climate scenario exercise of the OSFI is fatally flawed from the outset and would have catastrophic implications to the Canadian investment and banking sector if undertaken as a policy guideline for evaluating climate risk. Indeed, this misuse of RCP 8.5 would be a fraudulent misrepresentation of the future and would leave banks and financial institutions at risk of legal action from parties who were required to meet the OSFI's intended imposition of stringent climate risk reporting and investment alignments to a purely fictitious scenario that was never meant to be used in this way. And even though we're not supposed to use the RCP as a measure, what if we did? Well, where would we be today? Well, according to the UNFCCC, that's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the political arm of the climate global movement, if you like, we're at SSP 2-4.5 scenario, which means we're at the 4.5, we're below any sort of danger line on that chart. And also, let's look at what the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their most recent AR6 report says about using the RCP 8.5 as a business as usual scenario. This is what Roger Pielke reports from the IPCC. High-end scenarios like RCP 8.5 can be very useful to explore high-end risks of climate change, but are not typical business as usual projections and should therefore not be presented as such. So I don't know how we can make this any clearer. Anyway, there's no crystal ball at the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. As former international banker Parker Gallant noted in correspondence to Friends of Science Society, the OSFI didn't predict many of the debt crises over the past 30 to 40 years, so why did they suddenly think they're capable of predicting climate disasters? They missed the Asian debt crisis, the Latin American one, the Mexican one, the US mortgage, junk bonds one, etc., etc. But Canadian banks demonstrated their ability to see those events materialize, so weren't severely impacted. Meaning that we don't need this supervisor and regulator imposing climate risk on banks who are doing very well using their own thoughtful analysis. Furthermore, the Parliamentary Budget Officer puts the future financial climate risk to bed. Indeed, the alleged future financial climate risk in Canada has been put to bed by the November 8, 2022 assessment in the Parliamentary Budget Officer's report, which showed that Canada's GDP would grow 388% over the next 80 years. And according to the PBO, if we do nothing on climate, it will grow only 381%, meaning that there would be very nominal damage from climate inactivity, if you like. And in fact, the IPCC's fifth assessment report also concluded that the economic impact of climate change is small relative to other drivers. So why am I going there on this topic? Well, we often hear that, oh, hurry, it's a climate emergency. If we don't do something right now, the cost of inactivity will be enormous. Look at all the wildfires, look at all the floods, look at all the drought, look at all the bad things that have happened. If we take action right now, we'll stop that. Well, that's magical thinking to begin with. And the IPCC does not say that climate action will stop these extreme weather events, wildfires, floods, because these are just extreme events. These are not climate change. Climate change is measured over 30, 50, 100 millennial timescales. So these intermittent extreme weather events are not evidence of climate change. Climate change must be statistically measurable over these longer periods of time. And Ross McKittrick, an economist, said the cost of climate inaction is tiny. So the problem is that the compliance costs, if we try to meet the Paris target and we spend these billions of dollars, these compliance costs will take an order of magnitude more off our growth rate. And our president did this graph to show that really with a 2% per year growth in GDP, our GDP will grow to 10 trillion by 2102. If we do nothing with GHG emissions, our GDP will drop by just 140.5 billion. So compared to 10 trillion, that's nothing. If Canada spends its Paris Accord allotment, which is billions and trillions of dollars, the benefit would be just $17.1 billion. Now, remember that Calgary's Mayor Gondak already stepped up and threw $87 billion on the table for the alleged climate emergency in Calgary alone. So, that's just total folly. And the PBO also noted, while the impact on Canadian GDP is from global GHG emissions, Canada's own emissions are not large enough to materially impact climate change. And you can find out more about this graph and about this whole issue in these two items by our president, Ron Davidson. Now, interestingly enough, cited in the OSFI document is another document by the Bank of International Settlements. And they state that change in temperature in rich countries does not affect growth. So you can find this in that document. In rich countries, however, changes in temperature do not have a robust, discernible effect on growth. So no overseer of financial institutions is equipped to manage climate risk. Former international banker Parker Gallant noted in correspondence to Friends of Science Society. So the rich countries are not affected, and that presumably is related to their ability to spend the money on infrastructure to prevent climate disasters and their related costs. One need only look at the Netherlands, where 26% of its land is below sea level, but their infrastructure, built out over the centuries, allows them to live on that land. The foregoing statement from the Bank for International Settlements clearly notes mankind's ability to adjust to climate risks should they need to, and no overseer of financial institutions are equipped to make that call for either the banks or insurance companies. And again, that observation is confirmed by the Parliamentary Budget Officer's assessment of Canada's climate change risks. Now, another item that you might want to have a look at is this webinar with Roger PLK Jr. He's a longtime climate policy analyst, and he works very closely with the insurance industry on disasters and risk analysis and costs. And he states in this webinar, scenarios used in climate stress testing by central banks around the world are wildly implausible and of questionable practical utility. And as I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, conflating extreme weather with climate based on insured losses equals bad science and poor policy. And you may have seen graphs like this that appear to show, all these weather disasters are going up and so are the costs. This is from 2011, so it's rather out of date. But most of these analyses leave out the fact that there has been an increase in population living in exposed areas like coastal cities, like New York, Boston, cities of Florida, extreme fire risk areas of California, or urbanites living on acreages in Canada. that there's been a huge increase in property values of buildings in these areas, and that there's been an increase in reporting of damaging events and costs. For instance, if you had a wood or plaster beach house in the 1950s, it might not even have been insured. You might never have reported damage from, a big hurricane or storm at sea. But today's seaside mansion, located in the same place, surely is insured and for millions of dollars. So that would show up as a much more significant loss, even though it would be the same type of event. And furthermore, the increase in numbers of people living in higher risk areas with less wisdom, especially. So, for instance, this summer, the fires in Kelowna. Kelowna residents are building like condo-style cabin in the woods, where urbanites like their house nestled in the woods. And you can see pictures before and after of some of the houses that were damaged. They are, in fact, surrounded by pine trees, which are highly flammable. An experienced fire smart or fire wise, that's in the US, wilderness resident would have cleared all those trees back 100 feet or more from the house. So, yeah, a lot of places burnt down, and they should never have had all those trees right by their houses. One thing that's quite important is to understand that climate change isn't everything. And this is a book by Mike Hume. He's a professor from the University of Cambridge. I would say that he is on the humans cause global warming side, but he's not a crazy alarmist. And this book is quite down to earth, and he confronts this dangerously myopic view that reduces the condition of the world to the fate of global temperature or the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, to the detriment of tackling serious issues as varied as poverty, liberty, biodiversity loss, inequality, and international diplomacy. We must not live as though climate alone determines our present and our future. So I would strongly recommend that everybody read this book and get a grip. It's very down to earth. So the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, the very body that is supposed to prevent fraud and deception in financial practices, is actually engaging in fraud and deception. The OSFI mandate, we have to ask, how is it sound risk management to conflate weather and climate as they do? They're supposed to be fostering sound risk management and governance practices. And they are supposed to be advancing a regulatory framework designed to control and manage risk. But it's clear that by the OSFI misusing outlier climate scenarios and claiming that weather events are evidence of climate change is a form of fraud and deception. And most of all, there's an alarming departure from normative practice of risk assessment. So they say in this exercise that they're not going to use models that use historical experience to measure risks. Well, why wouldn't you? The entirety of the operation of money markets, insurance firms, and financial institutions rely on historical quantification in terms of credit risk, market trends, macro and micro, hedging against the possibility of losses, and having a diversified portfolio. As Superintendent Rutledge told the Canadian Senate on December 6, 2023, he would rather have a bank with 1,000 small trees than 3 big ones. Thus, it is a disconcerting departure from the norm to try and force financial institutions to not use traditional risk quantification techniques as models that use historical experience. History tells us almost all we need to know to prepare for the future. Abandoning historical evidence and trends to rely on mathematical models is the height of irresponsible management of assets. Now, how about the transition risk, though? This is something that many people bring up, particularly environmental groups. They love to talk about stranded assets. Stranded assets means, let's say Alberta has a lot of oil, gas, and coal assets. And the theory is that in the future, no one will use them, no one will want them, and the price of carbon taxes or the price on carbon will be so high that no one will even be able to afford them. So that's the theory of stranded assets, that you'll be stuck with these assets of fossil fuels that used to be worth a lot of money and now are worthless. So your enterprise will be bankrupted, or you'll have to pay severe penalties to get rid of these things. But let's see what an energy expert has to say about that. This is Václav Smil, and I really recommend that people watch his full presentation. He's talking with a group of engineers in Montreal, and he says, I want to leave you with 5 messages to take away. We are a fossil-fueled civilization. And he says that about 5 times. And then he continues and says, we shall remain so for a very long time to come, because energy transitions take a great deal of time, because scale matters, and so does power density. So power density refers to, say, the difference between wind and solar versus oil. Wind and solar are very diffuse. They are not dense at all. And oil or coal or natural gas are extremely dense. So there's a lot of power in a small amount of it. When he's talking about scale, you could have one hydro facility, but it might not serve enough people. So can you scale that up? Can you make more of them? Can you make it bigger? It depends on what scale you have as to how many people you can serve. And one of the values of fossil fuels is that it's portable. You can take it to different places. You can put it in your car and drive on it. You can put it on a tanker. You can put it on a ship and ship it around the world. And you can provide a large amount of dense power fuel almost anywhere in the world. So you can't do that with wind and solar, for instance. But let's look here at the transition over the past 100 years or so. So people used to use a lot of traditional biomass. That means burning dung, leaves, wood, and they used some coal. This was after the start of the Industrial Revolution, of course. And then over time, we started adding modern oil, gas, and developing electricity. And these things really took off here. But notice that we have not stopped using coal, and we haven't stopped using wood either. And in fact, wood pellets have made a comeback, both on a local personal level for some people and also as a major provider of electricity. So the thing is that you may have a transition to a new mix of energy provision, but you won't get rid of the existing ones. Transition is mentioned 80 times in the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions exercise. But here's the reality check. Where is the transition here? In the era of climate diplomacy, global fossil fuel consumption has increased by 57%. This was up to 2017. So to try and get to net zero down here by 2050, we would have to reduce 1 million tons of oil equivalent energy per day, every day, until 2050. And these are the equivalent forms of energy generation, replacing an equivalent amount of fossil fuels every day. So that's not going to happen. And you can see on this chart, there's no reduction whatsoever in traditional forms of energy, biomass, coal, oil, natural gas, hydropower, nuclear. These are not reducing. And so you can see there's a tiny bit of growth of wind and solar, but that's not going to turn into this. It took us 100 years to build this out. Wind and solar can't possibly take over this amount of energy in the next 20 years. And even the US Energy Information Administration states that energy consumption will grow. Now, they're a very respected forecaster of energy use around the world. And of course, most of that growth will be in the non-OECD countries. So that will be in the emerging nations. And those countries are not concerned about climate change. They're concerned about developing their economy and raising their people out of poverty. And you can see that fossil fuel use in the OECD countries is basically flatlined. So partly we've become more efficient, partly we've moved a lot of heavy industry offshore to places like China, and they're benefiting from it, and they want to grow their economies, so they're going to use way more coal and way more oil and natural gas. And we're going to commit economic suicide if we continue on this path. An interesting thing has come up regarding the proposals to force pension funds to divest from traditional oil companies. There's a high-profile lawsuit in the States, and they're suing New York City pension funds from divesting from traditional oil companies. And so this is by Steve Sukup, the Political Forum, who's the author of this book, and he's suggesting that there will be opposite kinds of lawsuits as well. But unfortunately, these now will be decided in the courts rather than decided by investors. And by forcing climate reporting compliance on financial institutions, it's just creating a whole new market for these, for lawfare, basically. Now, it's interesting that Superintendent Rutledge of the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions testified to the Senate Committee on Banking, Commerce, and the Economy on December the 6th. Now, he was talking with the senators about climate-aligned finance. So climate-aligned finance is a bill that Senator Rosa Galvez has put before the Senate. She's trying to push it through, as are a lot of environmental groups that are backing her. It's called Bill S-243, and the purpose of it is to force financial institutions to basically choke off financing to any firm that's engaged in fossil fuel use to any great degree, or in the development of fossil fuel energy. Of course, that would mean that costs would skyrocket, some of these industries would go out of business, and people would be sitting in the dark and cold, and the consequences could be very, very serious. So they were all talking about this bill that day, and part of the issue was related to climate risk, which is supposedly part of the bill that the Senator Rosa Galvez is presenting. But boom, 6 days later, the Icelandic, or not, it wasn't 6 days later, it was days later though, the Icelandic volcano erupted. Now, who had warning of that? Now, so far, that volcano hasn't affected climate, but the 1783 Laki eruption, which was in the same place in Iceland, did affect climate, and it had toxic gases that killed about 6 million people, and it caused famine around the world. And it affected climate. In the eastern United States, the winter average temperature was 4.8 degrees Celsius below the 225-year average, and the estimate for the temperature decrease of the entire northern hemisphere was about 1 degree Celsius. So you can see that graphed here. And of course, this is a rather short-term change in the weather and the climate, but it's very significant. And if you want to read a real frightening book, read this one. It's terrifying. But, how could a bank include that in their climate risk assessment? How could a bank or a pension fund include something like the Hunga Tonga Hunga Hapai volcano of 2022? This actually sent an unprecedented amount of water into the stratosphere, and water vapor is the most powerful greenhouse gas, not carbon dioxide. So it produced a shock wave felt around the world. It triggered tsunamis in Tonga, Fiji, New Zealand, Japan, Chile, Peru, and the US. It changed the chemistry and the dynamics of the stratosphere in the year following the eruption. It led to unprecedented losses in the ozone layer of up to 7% over large areas of the southern hemisphere. And driving those changes was the sheer amount of water vapor injected into the stratosphere by the undersea volcano. And some people say, some researchers say that the warming of the past few months, which seem to be quite unusual in most parts of the world. We had Antonio Guterres saying last fall that we're in the era of global boiling. Well, many researchers say that that was actually caused by the Hunga Tonga eruption and all that water vapor. So these effects are like ongoing. No bank can model that. Climate researchers can't even model that. How can a bank model that? You see, ultimately, climate change is a very complex, chaotic, non-linear set of dynamic interactions with all of these different elements interacting in different ways. So it's not something that can be calculated by a simple mathematical formula created by the Office of the Superintendent for Financial Institutions. And this little green dot gives you a sense of where human influence might be. This is a visualization by Henri Masson. He's a complex systems expert. And the real kicker is this. The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions has no explicit mandate to advance climate change objectives. So this came out of the Senate testimony. And he said the OSFI does not have an explicit mandate to advance climate change objectives, but they figured they're going to do it anyway. And as I mentioned before, Senator Rosa Galvez' Bill S-243 poses extreme risks to the energy sector in Canada, and of course to citizens as well. So it's clear that many parties perceive a real risk in this endeavor by the OSFI, particularly when tied to the proposed Bill S-243 on climate-aligned finance, sponsored by Senator Rosa Galvez and supported by a bevy of climate activist ENGOs and major charitable foundations. So Senator Geomagnetic had a question and he's looking at the climate-aligned finance bill. He says it seems to be very detailed in proposing a risk weight of 1,250% for any loan or bond related to fossil fuels. And he asks, what would the impact be on financing or access to capital for the Canadian economy? I'm worried because it might mean that Alberta or a sector of the economy would have difficulty securing financing from financial institutions. Correct me if I'm wrong. Can you clarify this? Now, another part of the Senate hearing goes on to talk about clean tech, and Chair Pamela Wallin, Senator Wallin, is talking about the numbers of 2022 Environmental, Social, and Governance, or ESG, performance reports, and she's talking about different banks with 84 billion, 96 billion, 107 billion, and their projections are to be in the range of 500 billion by 2025. She thinks that sounds like significant increases in terms of funding the transition. Now, we've already seen that the transition is not happening and very likely won't happen, but to set those numbers in context, the Canadian banking system is 8 trillion in assets. And so fundamentally, the clean tech sector growth is not happening. This is from Robert Lyman's presentation that he gave for us this fall, and he said that the clean tech sector accounted for 3% of the Canadian GDP in 2007. In 2021, following more than a decade of many billions of dollars of government subsidies, the sector's share of Canadian GDP was still 3%. It's not growing. Now, there's also a shocking lack of due diligence on the transition. So even though the word transition appears 80 times, it seems that nobody looked to see if there is a material supply chain to support the claimed transition, and there is not. This is an excerpt from Dr. Simon Michaud's presentation. You can also see his full report. He did this for the Geological Survey of Finland, and he simply did the math. So he said if global metal production was this amount in 2019, and we need this amount for one generation of technological units to phase out fossil fuels, well, then how much would we need at 2019 rates, and how many years would it take to produce that? So for copper, it would take 189.1 years. Okay, that's not going to be 2050, is it? Nickel would be 402.2 years, lithium 9,000 and something. You get the picture. It's just not going to happen. The material supply chain isn't there. So sadly, because of climate policies based on the RCP 8.5 outlier scenario, Canada has gone from a G7 powerhouse to hobos and homelessness. So you can see these are the 2014 ratios of emissions and sources in Canada, and here's how we're trying to cut them down. But emissions are related to productivity, energy, and quality of life. And you can see that what is happening as we're attempting to cut these emissions without new technology, and maybe if we had SMR, little small modular reactors, nuclear reactors, maybe if they were all market ready and out there, maybe we could cut a lot of these emissions without sacrificing our way of life or our industries. But there's presently no technology to achieve these reductions. This requires shutting down major industries completely, while the rest of the world builds more coal, natural gas, and oil terminals and industry, and no other nation is doing this. So in closing, the big problem is Earth's magnetic field is weakening, and this will have some impacts on climate change, which we are not in a position to determine. However, it's clear that carbon pricing will do nothing to prepare us for these changes, nor does it address the multifaceted elements that drive climate change on Earth. And there are a number of reports that you can find online. A solar flare could wipe out a lot of the technology. So we shouldn't be worried about the RCP 8.5 climate change. We should be more concerned about hardening the grid and being prepared for these kind of very powerful and very real potential events from outer space, especially now that our Earth's magnetic field is weakened. So if we look here, rather than the OSFI forcing Canadian banks to play climate astrologer with these models, it would be incumbent upon the OSFI to order Canadian financial institutions to support and strengthen Canada's energy security, to provide financing and encouragement for the hardening of our power grids, and to finance agricultural operations and innovation willingly and enthusiastically. And this last note from Robert Lyman, he says it's just a political effort to harm investment in Canada's resource sector to serve an ideologically motivated agenda. Now, Robert Lyman is a former federal public servant of 27 years, 10 years a diplomat, and he's asked a fundamental question of this exercise and of the OSFI. When did it become the responsibility of regulators of financial institutions to impose their views on the investment risks that such institutions take? Do they assess the risks of war? Do they assess the risk of a worldwide pandemic? Do they assess the risk of economic depressions driven by excessive public and private indebtedness? I do not believe so, and if they did, what evidence can they provide that their knowledge of the future exceeds that of the financial institutions or of major investors? The answer surely is that, with respect to potential changes in the weather, climate, or other factors, the regulator has no special knowledge or expertise that empowers them to second-guess the institutions they regulate. This whole exercise should be labeled for what it is, a political effort to harm investment in Canada's resource sector to serve an ideologically motivated agenda. So, in our view, the OSFI SCSE exercise is fatally flawed from the get-go and should be withdrawn. And most of all, carbon dioxide is not a control knob that can fine-tune climate, and we've got lots more about that on our website. So please read our report. I've covered a lot of the points. There are more within the report. And if you like our work, why don't you join us? Why don't you donate? You could send an e-transfer. If this has been informative, even a small amount of money would be helpful. We are a volunteer-run nonprofit. We operate in Alberta, and we provide our services free of charge to everyone in the world who's interested in climate and energy policy. We're not a charity, so we don't issue tax receipts. And every little bit helps. We operate on about $150,000 a year from our members and our donors, and most of our donations are under $100. So we're not a proxy for any industry. We're just a group of interested citizens, scientists, and business people who want to have open civil debate on climate and energy policies and full cost-benefit analysis. So we should never get to the point, like I've presented in this video, that the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions is going right off the rails with a RCP 8.5 scenario that's not even related to reality in any way. If we had proper open civil debate and full cost benefit analysis, we would never have gotten to this point. So that wraps up the presentation. I thank you very much for sticking with me and listening to all these details. I hope it helps you understand where this critical fault is and where the climate emergency concept comes from. It comes from the misuse of these RCP 8.5 scenarios, in particularly the 8.5. Once we take that off the charts and we don't use it anymore, there's no climate emergency, and we do have time. So thanks very much. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.